Ricardo greets the young man on the street and asks if he is a delivery rider. The young man says yes, so Ricardo explains that he needs to deliver a small package to his wife. The problem is, she lives on the other side of the city, which is a bit far, and he currently has no money for a bus. Ricardo then asks if the delivery rider could do him the favor of delivering the medicine to his wife, and he would pay him later. The delivery rider says he works as a courier but only does the job if people pay him, otherwise, he doesn't do it. Ricardo insists that the delivery rider help him, but the rider refuses and says that no one works for free. The rider even excuses himself as he is already late for a delivery. He starts his motorbike and leaves the scene. At this moment, Ricardo approaches another young man on the street who is on a bicycle this time and asks if he is a delivery rider, to which the young man says yes. Ricardo explains that he needs to get this medicine to his wife because she is very sick and he has no money to call a taxi, take a bus, or use a ride-hailing service. He only had money to buy the medicine, but the problem is that her house is on the other side of the city, which is far. Ricardo just wants to know if he could deliver it and be paid later. Ricardo says he would go on foot, but he needs the delivery rider just to get the medicine there faster because his wife is suffering a lot. That's why he's asking for this favor. The young man complains that the location is very far, and besides, his bicycle tire is flat. Ricardo understands and says he wouldn't ask for this favor if it weren't an emergency, as his wife has been bedridden for a while and can't even get out of bed. He just managed to go downtown to do a job to get the money for the medicine, but he only managed to get the money for the medicine. It's an expensive medicine, and he needs to get it to her urgently. If the delivery rider could do him this favor, Ricardo would compensate him in another way and help him a lot later. The delivery rider says he could help, but first, he needs to fix the tire, otherwise, he won't be able to go. Ricardo asks if he would really go, and the young man says yes. Ricardo says he will give him the exact address since he's willing to go, so he'll take advantage of it. Ricardo gives the address and the medicine to the young man. Ricardo says once again that he will find a way to pay the young man for the trip, but the delivery rider tells him not to worry. He will just fix the bike tire and deliver the medicine to the address. The young man says he will definitely deliver the medicine to the address, and Ricardo thanks him very much, saying the delivery rider is an angel in his life because he had already asked other people on motorbikes, which would be much faster, but they refused, and he, even on a bicycle, is helping. The delivery rider says he understands because he sometimes needs help too, and no one stops to help. Anyway, Ricardo thanks him again and says he will send a message to his wife saying the young man is on his way to deliver the medicine. At this moment, Renata, Marcelo's wife, is waiting in front of her house for the delivery rider her husband sent. The delivery rider, whose name is Pedro, arrives and asks if she is Ricardo's wife, and Renata says yes. He says he has a delivery for her that her husband asked him to drop off. Renata says he looks very tired and offers him some water. The young man thanks her and even asks to sit down and rest a bit, asking if he came from far away. Pedro says yes, he actually met Ricardo who asked him to deliver this medicine, but his bicycle tire got flat during the journey, so he couldn't get there very quickly. Renata says it's okay and asks if he doesn't have a lot of back pain since the bag looks very heavy to carry around all day. Pedro says that when he has many deliveries, it does hurt. Sometimes he takes about 10 deliveries to earn extra income. Renata asks if he delivers only by bicycle, and he says yes. Pedro says he used to have a motorbike but ended up crashing it accidentally, so he had to get a bicycle to work because fixing the motorbike was too expensive. That's why he had to buy this bicycle to work, earn extra money, and help at home. He also said he's saving up to buy a new motorbike, but it's been tough because he's working this way. Pedro shared that he starts working very early and only stops late at night. Renata asked if he ever worked overnight, and he said yes, he worked a week of night shifts to try and save more money. Renata asks if he has a family, and he says yes, but he's living alone in the city. He moved to the city a year ago and found a very small house that is helping him because it's all he can afford. Pedro said he actually came to the city alone. Renata asks if he ever had a wife or kids, and he says he did, but they separated, and now she and his son live in another city, and he has to always send money to support them. Renata asks if he always calls them, and he says yes, he always calls, asks for help to buy a present, buy something they need. Renata asks how old his son is, and Pedro says he's 4 years old. Anyway, Renata asks if he's been working since the morning, and he says yes, and now he's switching to night shifts, even making deliveries until dawn. Renata asks how many deliveries he makes a day. Pedro explains that with the bicycle, he can do about 5 deliveries from morning until mid-afternoon, and at night he can take 5 or 6 more. Renata asks if he delivers to very far places, and Pedro says yes. Sometimes he takes deliveries very far, but those pay the best, so it's worth it sometimes. Pedro says he can't afford to turn down any deliveries when he needs money, so he takes any kind of delivery that pays. Renata asks if he wants more water, but he says no, it's enough, but she says he must be very thirsty since it was very hot today. He agrees and explains that getting there was hard because his bicycle tire got flat 3 times, and he had to push it up the street. If the tire shop is open, he says he will try to fix the tire. Anyway, Renata notices he isn't wearing any protective gear and asks if he doesn't have a sun shirt, raincoat, or something in case something unexpected happens. Pedro says he doesn't have any because it's very expensive, and he hasn't been able to find anyone to buy from. He's prioritizing his family, who is in another city, and he left there with the goal of trying to make it here, and although it's been very difficult, he hasn't stopped trying. At this moment, Ricardo arrives, greets his wife and the young man again, says he managed to get there quickly because he got a ride, and asks if Pedro has been there long. Pedro says no, he just arrived too. Ricardo thanks him again and tells his wife that the young man delivered the medicine as a favor without charging anything because he only had money for the medicine. Ricardo says it was very kind of him, thanks him again, and points out that the tire was flat and Pedro had to keep pumping it up. Ricardo says he was very fast. Renata remembers that Pedro said the tire got flat 3 times before he got there. Ricardo remembers that the distance from downtown to their house is 10 kilometers and asks if Pedro only delivers by bicycle because it looks old and worn out. Pedro says it's a tough bike and has been with him for a while. Ricardo says he's right because we have to get by, and we can't stay home and wait for help. Pedro says he was lucky to find a shortcut and get there on time. Ricardo thanks Pedro once again, then asks his wife if the medicine is there. Renata says yes, and Ricardo asks her to open it and check if it's the right one. They open the bag and check the medicine, confirming it's the right one. Ricardo thanks Pedro once again, saying he helped a lot. Ricardo then asks Pedro, since he always sees people delivering by motorbike, if he has ever faced any prejudice when arriving by bicycle, for instance, people thinking he would be slower and the food might arrive cold. Pedro says that has happened before. There were times he was only a minute or 2 late, and people complained, but he tries not to be late. Ricardo points out that nowadays everyone can track deliveries on apps and see if they're on time. Ricardo then asks Pedro if he has ever heard of a social experiment, and Pedro says no. Ricardo takes the medicine bag and asks Pedro to check what medicine he was delivering to Ricardo's house. Ricardo asks if he looked inside the bag, and Pedro says no because he wanted to get there as fast as possible since it was medicine, and Ricardo said he was in a hurry. Ricardo reveals that his wife is not sick, and this was a prank they played. Pedro realizes there's money inside the bag. Ricardo says there are $3,000 in the bag, and Pedro was carrying $3,000 without even knowing. He didn't open the bag, showing his honesty and big heart, and that's why Ricardo decided to give the $3,000 to Pedro. Ricardo explains that he was conducting this experiment, and whoever volunteered to do this good deed would get the money, so now the money belongs to Pedro, and Ricardo hopes it helps him. Ricardo is very happy and says that besides fixing the bicycle tire, he can even buy another one. Renata asks if he can buy a present for his son or something. Ricardo says they were just planning a simple prank, but Pedro's story moved them a lot. Ricardo asks his wife if she thought the same as him, and she says yes, so he decides to do one more thing. He asks Pedro to look under the red blanket and asks if he knows what's under it. Pedro says no, he can't imagine, but from a distance, it looks like a motorbike. Ricardo asks him to help remove the blanket, and Pedro reveals that it is indeed a motorbike, and that this motorbike is his. Ricardo bought it 2 months ago. but rarely uses it as he's always busy driving a car around. Ricardo reveals that the motorbike now belongs to Pedro. At this moment, Pedro is moved to tears. Renata asks if he's happy and if the motorbike will help him with his deliveries and make his life easier. Pedro says yes, and that besides this, with the money, he will also be able to send some to his family. Renata says it's all thanks to his effort and determination. Ricardo says now Pedro has a motorbike to work with, but he asks Pedro to pass on these values to his son. Ricardo says Pedro deserves this because he didn't give up, he took a bicycle and went after his livelihood to send money to his family, so he's truly a warrior, an example. Pedro says he's very grateful and this will help a lot, and it's more than enough. Ricardo asks if Pedro has ever done this before, delivering something for free for someone, and Pedro says no, he usually helps, but never with deliveries. Ricardo says now the motorbike belongs to Pedro, and he will take care of the paperwork and transfer it to his name because he deserves it. Ricardo hopes this motorbike will be a turning point in his life because he deserves it and everything will work out. Pedro thanks him very much and is emotional. Ricardo asks if he is happy, and Pedro says yes. Ricardo asks if he ever imagined that he would make a delivery and end up with a motorbike, and Pedro says of course not. Renata points out that, especially since it was a free delivery because he didn't charge anything. Ricardo congratulates him again and says he deserves this a lot, and now he will go inside to get the documents and come back so Pedro can take the motorbike. As for the bicycle, Ricardo asks what they can do with it, and Pedro says he wants to keep it as a memento. Ricardo suggests leaving it there, but Pedro insists on keeping it. Ricardo says he will get the motorbike documents and be right back. Ricardo explains that Pedro's story is fantastic. He was planning a simple prank to give the money, but he couldn't help but give the motorbike because Pedro is a warrior and deserves it, and much more. So share this video to reach as many people as possible so that good examples are followed, and comment from which city you are watching this video.